This is the official Cold War Iceberg, which details the events from 1945 to 91. This was based on the iceberg made by Reddit user oldthrace. I added some of my own entries as well. The first two layers have many simplistic entries of just important leader names and country names, but I assumed that would be a waste of your time. Thank you. Layer 1. The Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is a term used for the borders between Anglo-American controlled Europe and Soviet-controlled Europe that was divided after the Second World War. Winston Churchill was the one who came up with the quote in 1946. Communism. Communism is an ideology created by Karl Marx and was followed by the elite of the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1991. Communism is the workers' control of the means of production, with a philosophy of a proletariat overthrow of the capitalist bourgeoisie in a world revolution. The Marxist theory of history suggests that the supposed capitalist states of the West were trying to oppress the proletariat-run Soviet Union. Capitalism. Capitalism is a private control of the means of production that many say was the U.S. economic system in opposition to communism during the Cold War, although I would argue that the East Coast elite abandoned capitalism by 1913. The U.S. role in the Cold War is better explained as an anti-communist movement, as many of the regimes the U.S. supported weren't free market advocates, though the Americans viewed communism as a direct threat to the American way of life and were opposed to the world revolution the Communist Internationale stood for. NATO signed the Treaty of Alliance and Mutual Assistance in 1947 and had expanded into Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg as well. Both the US and the Treaty of Nations had an interest to create a military alliance together as an anti-Soviet expansionist alliance that could deter a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. So in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established with the previously mentioned states as well as Italy, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Portugal, and Canada. The Soviet Union even requested to join NATO as an attempt from the Western powers to use Germany as a militarized power against them. As Germany joined NATO in 1955, weeks later, the Eastern European states would sign the Warsaw Treaty Organization. The NATO alliance still exists to this day and has added many more European states. Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Treaty Organization was created in 1955 as a military alliance between the Soviet Union, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and East Germany. The Russians had been invaded twice by Germany in the last 30 years, and any threat of using the continental European powers, backed by the US and UK, seemed like a possibility to the Soviets, so they created the Warsaw Pact as a buffer between the USSR and the West. The Soviets could fight off NATO before their doorstep in case of a possible war with them. Cuba requested to join the pact but was never accepted. The alliance was dissolved in 1991. Cuban Missile. Perhaps the most famous moment of the Cold War was when Premier Khrushchev launched Operation Anadir, of placing nuclear weapons in Cuba to deter a U.S. invasion after the successful communist revolution of Fidel Castro. The U.S. discovered the missiles, which led to a tense few weeks in 1962 under President Kennedy and Khrushchev worked out a secret deal that the U.S. would withdraw nuclear weapons placed in Turkey and that Khrushchev would withdraw all nukes from Cuba. Korean War. After World War II, Korea was divided between the USSR and the US, with a half promise to reunite the country in the future. In 1950, President Truman announced he was withdrawing all American troops from South Korea, and North Korean leader Kim Il-sung took this opportunity to reunite the country himself by launching a surprise attack on the South. The initial invasion had success and pushed the South all the way to the bottom corner. The United Nations had agreed to send a US-led force to repel the communist invasion. Vetoed as the Chinese seat was still held by the Kuomintang faction that governed Taiwan, and the Soviets were boycotting the UN because the Chinese communists didn't have their own right. MacArthur made an amphibious invasion of Incheon near the city of Seoul, which put the North Koreans on the back foot. Communist leader Mao Zedong was concerned of American control of the Korean peninsula, so he sent his own army to repel the UN force, until an armistice was signed in 1953, leaving the Korean peninsula in the same situation it is to this day. A million people lost their lives in this conflict. Vietnam War. During World War II, France was taken over by Germany and French Indochina was taken over by Japan. Ho Chi Minh was a resistance leader who fought against the Japanese. After World War II, France wanted to get their colony back, but they were defeated and withdrew in 1954. Indochina was then partitioned to create the states of Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam, which was pro-Soviet, and South Vietnam, which was pro-France. The US intervened to protect South Vietnam from falling to communism. The US pulled out in 1973, and South Vietnam fell to the North in 1975 after a resumption of fighting due to the oil crisis. It fought Cambodia as well as China in the 70s and 80s. At least 2 million people lost their lives in the Indochina Wars, though it is likely millions higher. Soviet-Afghan War. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to protect the communist government from being overthrown by American-backed Islamists. The US, Muslim states, and China backed the Mujahideen, which was a resistance against the atheist infidels as they perceived them. The Soviet Union withdrew in 1989. The Soviet-Afghan War was considered one of the most important events leading to the Soviet collapse. Over 1 million died in the conflict. Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was a U.S. foreign affairs doctrine signed in 1947 that was based on the containment policy advocate George Kennan. The policy was to contain all communist expansion throughout the world with economic and military assistance, as communism could only survive if it expanded. Many consider the Truman Doctrine to be the start of the Cold War. Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was built by the USSR in 1961 in East Berlin to prevent migration between the East and West sections, keeping all East Berliners from West Berlin, as many had been fleeing. Over 100 people were killed trying to cross the Berlin Wall. It came down in 1989, though some sections are still able to be viewed to this day. The Space Race. The space race was a challenge to prove who is technologically superior throughout the Cold War. The Soviets launched the first satellite in space in 1957, then the first man in 1961. The US launched the first human on the moon in 1969. The Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975 held the first US-Soviet joint space mission together. We all know that space is fake anyway.